Hi, everybody. My name is Bao Nong, and I'm an Apps Partnerships Manager with Google. And welcome to today's episode of Google Partners Academy on Air. Today, we're going to be talking about improving your user acquisition campaigns with in-app events. And specifically, we're going to be talking about mobile app games. So whether you're a game developer or whether you're a marketing partner working with gaming clients, this talk will hopefully be very helpful for you. A bit of background on myself, I'm actually a huge gamer at heart. I still play a lot of games nowadays, whether it's on mobile, console, or PC. So for example, I actually just got Destiny 2 for the PC on Tuesday when it launched. So very excited about that. On the mobile gaming side, I'm very much addicted, and I'd say I'm a whale in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. So I have a bit of background in games myself and really excited to talk a bit more about how you can help your gaming partners grow. So to do a bit of a recap, if you've been watching the previous episodes, you probably know how to best do user acquisition for Google on mobile apps, but the primary campaign type to do that with us is Universal App Campaigns. So as a quick overview, what is Google's Universal App Campaigns? It's a single campaign type that allows you to actually advertise your Android or iOS app on all of our networks at the same time, which is great because if you look at the entire Google network, there's quite a bit in terms of the Google Play Store, and then as well as mobile Google search. And then, of course, you also have other areas such as our AdMob network, which shows ads within other apps, and then on the mobile web, and then, of course, YouTube. So as this is a lot to manage manually, how the campaign does it is it actually does it all automatically, powered by, of course, our patented Google machine learning. The idea is that it can help you find high-value players and other players that matter to you by looking at all the signals throughout the Google network, and there are quite a few. I believe the actual numbers nowadays are about 300 million signals, and based off that, it can make about 200,000 decisions all at the same time based off all these signals. So it's a lot to manage for a single person or even a marketing team to do, so it's great that our machine learning algorithm is able to actually do that. And again, to really talk a bit more about how this specifically works for Universal App Campaigns, it takes a lot of the work that you had to do before with manual optimization, such as targeting, demographics, all of those sorts of things. And instead, all you really have to tell the campaign is just the basic things related to your KPIs and related to your app, such as bids and budgets, etc. So that's why today's talk is specifically on the KPIs piece in terms of how can I use these Universal App Campaigns and improve that with signals coming from my mobile app. And one of the main ways to do it with our newest versions of Universal App Campaigns is through in-app events. So before we get started about some ideas of what these events could be for your game specifically, let's make sure first you're tracking them the correct way. So there's three main ways to actually track events for your game to be able to use in AdWords. The easiest way is if you have an Android app, we do have codeless conversions available to track the basics, such as the actual install or download of the app, and then, of course, the actual in-app purchase, since you can pass that back from Google Play. But for other developers that want to go a bit more beyond that and track other events, I would pay a lot more attention to two other main avenues to do this. One is through Firebase Analytics. As a quick refresher, if you don't know what Firebase is, it's a free SDK that we released about a year or so ago. And one of those features of Firebase is Firebase Analytics, where you can basically set up attribution and event tracking for your game, so long as you have the SDK in there. So that's been working out well for some developers. And then, of course, if you're a developer that is using a third-party MMP, you can also leverage that platform to pass back data into that platform and then pass that back to AdWords via server-to-server reporting. So before even getting into any of this, you definitely want to make sure that you have this tracking solution set up for yourself that actually works the best for you. Now, before we get into other specific in-app events for your game, it turns out that you could actually still use a lot of our Universal App Campaigns, even with standard in-app events. What I mean by standard in-app events is that these are the in-app events that most of the time, if you already have Firebase set up, or if you already have a third-party MMP set up, these are typically the in-app events that are what we would call standard and already imported or ready for your game. So as you can see here, the first opener, the actual app install, is pretty straightforward. Some games do have an actual registration sign-up process, but most of the games you're probably thinking of definitely have some form of a tutorial, as well as a level up event And then, of course, when it comes to revenue, a lot of gaming developers track in-app purchases and first-time purchase. So I would actually say, even if you're just starting off and then you think, wow, we're just really starting universal app campaigns and we're still wrapping our heads around the idea that you can use in-app events to optimize these campaigns, these events are still fine to start off with. In fact, most developers that are very concerned about return on ad spend or ROI will typically try to find players at scale that do in-app purchases, and that's totally okay. What this talk is primarily going to be all about, though, are the specific in-app events that you may want to consider using when you want to go beyond that, where you might think, you know what, maybe some of the other in-app events we could use are reflective of what high value could be. And maybe the other thing that could happen is you're having some issues with getting some scale in terms of finding users that are doing in-app purchases or doing some of these other events frequently enough for our campaigns to really kick into high gear. So in that scenario, that's where you're going to want to start branching out of these standard in-app events and then consider other events in your game that could still lead to value for you. Now, what do I mean by value? It can mean one of two things, primarily. So the first thing is always ties back to the revenue, right? As most game developers to survive would want to make sure their game is profitable. So understanding value is key because as this study from Radium One has showed, as well as other data points out there in the industry, not every single user is always contributing to your revenue. In some cases, potentially 17% or only 20% of your users are actually contributing to your overall revenue. So the reason why you would want to make sure that you understand how to find those users more effectively is because you want to basically be able to either weed out or more effectively go after users contributing to your bottom line. The similar kind of numbers could actually be used for retention, which is another key indicator and a key goal for most of these gaming developers. As we all know, not 100% of users would still play a game even after a week or two. While most games are always trying to improve their retention rate, most of the time, maybe only half of them stick around for the first week or even the first few days. And then maybe only 30% stick around for the first month, right? So if you understand what events lead to value and lead to players playing your game longer, that's also key too. So being able to give our campaigns, our machine learning signals to understand, well, what are these users doing and what makes them so valuable? Understanding that will help the machine find more examples and continue to find those users at scale that are ultimately going to be playing your game a bit longer. And as you would expect, now that we've automated a lot of things with universal app campaigns, marketers don't have to spend so much time managing Google-specific things when it comes to campaign, and instead have a lot more time to work with other departments to actually grow how you buy. So here are some examples of some very key questions that now, as marketers, you have time to actually do. You could actually ask some of these questions to the other departments. So for example, I would imagine some of these questions that you would want to answer to your BI team are, hey, what actions in the user funnel are actually indicators for valuable users? And how do I actually know that a user is valuable in the short term versus the long term, right? And then you can even go beyond that. And let's say you start using these in-app events to bolster how you buy. And then you start noticing, along with the BI team and maybe even the development team, that there are some clear drop-offs in terms of the user experience. Maybe a lot of users are getting to level 5 pretty consistently, but then you see a, let's say, 40% drop-off from users who actually make it to level 7 or even level 10, right? Now, with so much more free time shored up for the marketer to understand how that all works, you can actually go to your dev team, your BI team, and any other teams in your departments to ask those specific questions to even improve just the actual app itself or the game itself. Because as marketers would know, whenever your game is doing great, that means everything else is going well, especially how you actually buy. So those are some of the things that marketers will now be able to do with the freed up time done with universal app campaigns. So to go a bit further in, I'm going to go over 3 specific sort of models that most games in general take form. And with that, give you some ideas of example genres, and then eventually example in-app events you can consider using for either your game or your client's game. Now, these are just very, very, very general ideas and events. It's always going to differ between each and every individual game. And in my opinion, there are quite a few games out there now that meld genres and meld models together. So please only use this as a very basic level of understanding, and then work specifically with either your team or your gaming client to further bolster out what events, what model makes the most sense for them. And I'm actually a huge fan of Mario, if you haven't noticed. So you'll notice on some of these slides, I put a couple of those references in there. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So the first model is basically what I call the simple model. And it's these sorts of games where the gameplay experience is quite literally the same every time. So every time you pick up your phone, you get into the game, you play through a level or two, the experience is not going to change. But why do people keep playing it? Well, it's because it's fun, to be honest. And most of the time, since it is a very similar experience and it's mostly done when it's fun, it's either a short player life cycle. Well, they'll be into it. It'll be a bit of a fad for maybe a couple of weeks or maybe a month. And then they'll taper off and play another game. Or it's very sporadic, where whenever I feel like I want to play a game of solitaire or whatever that is, I'll just go ahead and play it, right? So for games that have this sort of model, some example genres here include traditional card games. So I just mentioned solitaire, but a lot of the other card games you're thinking of fall under here, as well as classic arcade games, such as, let's say, Maze Runner, or even these other platformers like Mario. And then a couple other genres that are a bit more general, your board games, some educational, trivia, or even word games that are very straightforward. So those are the types of games that fall in this sort of model. So when understanding, okay, well, if I know that my game or my client's game is in this kind of model, what kind of events could I particularly use? Well, a lot of these games, they typically focus on retention as a main key performance indicator. So a couple of examples of events that can help determine, hey, actually, some of these events could lead to a high value user. That basically means I'm going to be playing the game a lot more. Could be how many games are actually played. And there's a few different ways to measure this. You could either take a look at the raw number of games or potentially the number of games done at a specific time. It really depends on how the developer is really setting up these sorts of events and then how they actually track it. So it could be a matter of days, it could be the raw count, but either way, understanding how often and how many times or how many games a user is playing is very key towards retention, and sometimes can be a lot more of an interesting indicator than whether or not they just pop back into the game after a certain number of days. So I definitely recommend looking at that event as one of the key events to track retention. The other thing I would consider if some of these games have this functionality is looking at the actual player score, because sometimes you might have a lot of players that play very frequently, but then you might also have players that play and are able to do very well and hit a high score. That might then lead them into wanting to play a lot more aggressively or just play more frequently because they want to continue to build their high score. So for some of the developers where that can matter for them, that's a really creative way of looking at that too. Because as you optimize your campaigns or use some of these high score events in your campaigns, you might be able to then have the machine learning figure out, oh, okay, it looks like some of these users that are more likely to play a lot longer, get a higher score, they seem more valuable to you. So let me get those users at scale, as opposed to these users that might open the app, might install the app, but you don't really know what they're doing after that. And then, of course, one of the last events for retention is definitely the login time and frequency. And this is pretty typical because most developers, if they're tracking this, they'll track that, for example, a good percentage of D3 retention basically just means, hey, they popped it back into the game after 3 days. So that's totally fine too. And that's still a very accurate way to measure retention. But if you use these events as retention events in your universal app campaigns, you can then start pointing the campaign to find users at scale that are going to be more likely doing these things, again, as opposed to just opening the app and you don't really necessarily know what they'll do after that. When it comes to revenue, because of course these games still need to make money, most of the time, a lot of these games with this very simple model, most of the revenue comes from in-app ads. So for some developers that are able to actually track this accurately, looking at the number of ads watched and actually using that as a potential in-app event to pass back into AdWords to optimize your campaigns could be interesting, because that actually would be then a way to optimize your campaign towards profitable users. If you know that, for example, you make a fair amount of good margin on users who watch, let's say, 10 ads a day or whatever that is, that could be something very interesting, right? And if you are a game developer that cares a lot about ROI, or you're a marketing partner working with a gaming client that cares a lot about ROI, this is where the revenue piece can come into play. So these are some examples for simple model games, but really would just summarize this by saying that a lot of the times retention-based events are going to be the best way to really use universal app campaigns to find valuable users. If you happen to have things set up where you can track revenue, can track number of ads watched, definitely do it, because that will help your campaigns get you more users that are going to be more ROI positive for you. Now, moving on to the next model, I would say this is what I would call the normal model. And the idea of games in this model is that the gameplay experience actually starts changing a bit or gets challenging more over time. And that's because the reason why people keep playing is not because it's the same game every time I open up the game, but let's say I play for about an hour and reach a certain number of levels. Well, now maybe there's new levels for me to unlock or maybe new ways to play, right? So for games that have this sort of model or functionality behind them, oftentimes the player life cycle is in what we call the medium range. So this ranges per developer. I wouldn't want to say this is an exact number by any means. But for some developers, this can mean a 1 month, 3 month, or even 6 month life cycle, depending on what they would consider medium or long. But in other words, in this model, it's a lot much longer than the simple model because there's more reasons for users to continue playing, even though the experience doesn't change a whole lot. So some example genres that fall into this would be the new style arcade games, where instead of the simple model where you would just play the game and that's kind of the only way it's played, again, maybe there might be some new things that are unlocked. Other types of genres that fall into this category are a lot more broad now too. So of course you have your casino games or social casino games, which includes things such as slots or other things that you would play in a Las Vegas casino. Casual games would be another genre, but to be very honest, there's a lot of games that fall under this category. But even though they're considered casual, most developers nowadays are putting in more functionalities to give users, to give players more reasons to play for much longer. Music games and puzzle games also fall under here too. Music games would be, for example, rhythm-based games. And puzzle games, I'm sure a lot of you know or can already think of your favorite match 3 puzzle type sorts of games. And these are definitely the ones that have this model where the more you play, the more levels you unlock and the more fun it gets. So it's not quite simple. And then, of course, you have other genres here, including racing, word, and sports games. So when it comes to examples of in-app events you could use to help optimize your campaigns, it starts changing a little bit. So you still have the idea of if your goal is retention, you can still focus on events that measure login time or frequency. But the other thing you can start looking at too are some other more advanced signals of retention, such as the number of levels or stages complete. Because as I mentioned, most of the models for these games will include actually new things, new features unlocked the further a player actually progresses through the game. So definitely recommend looking at that as a potential event to use as a main signal. And then some of these games will start adding in some social elements, such as the ability to actually invite and even add friends to your friends list. So you can either play with them or to share your accomplishments or scores with your friends. And for the most part, whenever players have that functionality and they actually get their friends to play along with them, they're going to stick around for a lot longer if they were just playing on their own. So definitely another key event in terms of measuring retention to help you find more users that are more willing to play your game much longer, as opposed to just opening up the app. When it comes to revenue, there's a few other things that you can consider too. The first thing that I've seen a lot of developers actually do nowadays is actually use the idea of what I would call free samples. So the idea is that some of the functionality of the game involves that you can basically use real money to purchase very cool items or even other things within the game. But to get players used to the idea of actually doing that, they would allow players to actually experience it for free, sort of like a free sample, which is why I use the word. So the reason why this could be tied to revenue is that if you are able to actually understand that a certain percentage of users who partake in these free samples end up actually leading to a certain set of users that eventually make real in-app purchases, that's actually really key. So that is a very interesting in-app event you can consider using and pointing your campaigns towards so that you get more users at scale that are more likely to actually engage with this part of the game, because later on, a certain percentage of them might actually lead to then profitable users for you. So I definitely wouldn't underestimate the value of this sort of in-app event. And a lot of developers nowadays do have some ways to allow users to do that. In addition to that, you can actually start going beyond and looking at specific in-app purchases that a user is actually making. Because if you do a lot of research with your BI teams, with your dev teams, and then you realize that actually it turns out that 60% of our revenue comes from players who actually purchase this item instead of this item, well, then that would probably make you think that it would make a lot of sense to at least be able to track that to optimize your campaigns that way. So that's why for these types of games in their models, the thing that people actually spend their money on is typically additional playtime, which comes in either the form of coins or even stamina, or as I mentioned here, additional boosts, which basically help improve how the game actually works while you're actually playing it, so that by the time that a user is accomplishing specific levels and then they think, I want to go even higher, they actually do these additional boosts and will be willing to pay real money for that, right? So that's the other thing, is that when games start becoming in this model, you want to start looking at events that happen, what we would call mid-funnel, right? So maybe they happen before the actual valuable event that matters to you, which in this case could be revenue. And for some games that have a lot of that in-app event data already going through AdWords, maybe they want to go a bit further. And that's where some of these other ideas of looking at the actual thing the user purchased or what users are actually buying can be very interesting to consider and would be a lot of great data to, again, help optimize your campaigns you're running with Google. And lastly, especially a lot of the mid-core, hardcore games nowadays, they adopt what I call the advanced model. So this is where the gameplay experience completely evolves over time. So it's not even a matter of just new levels or just slightly newer things to do. Literally, what you could be doing on your first few days of the game might look completely different by the time you're still playing the game in the first month, because there's just lots to do. So many more things get added into the game. To give you an example, there might be some hardcore games where in the beginning, you're probably just going through either the story mode or some just regular base levels. But then by the time you get to your first month of the game, maybe you're doing a lot of competitive matches against your friends or even people around the world, right? Or maybe there's some things where you can actually join up with groups of players called guilds or clans and actually experience new things that way. So whenever games have this model where it just seems like there's a lot to do, the more you keep playing, that's when you start getting into a very long player life cycle. So these are games that very easily get past the first couple of months, and maybe a long life cycle for them is half a year, or for some games, maybe even longer than that, right? So in terms of genres, a lot of the examples you're probably thinking of are here: action games, adventure games. When it comes to card games, and you're probably thinking of Hearthstone, there are these card games coming out now that are either more trading card based or RPG based, and they actually adopt a lot of the concepts that some of these more hardcore games do. So definitely pay attention to that. And then of course, the other standard genres you see here are role-playing games, simulation games, and definitely strategy games. So if any of your games or your clients' games fall in these genres, they definitely have an advanced model, which then means there's actually a whole host of in-app events you can definitely use. So to take a look at some examples here, let's say the client or you as a developer are really concerned about getting high retentive players, right? So a lot of the similar things from the other models come into play. The number of chapters or stages is a really interesting thing to look at. But since most of these games may have a social element, I would definitely encourage, if you're a developer or you as a developer is tracking this, take a look at players who are actually playing a lot of player versus player, or what I would call PvP, matches. Because again, players that show that they're very social and are willing to play a lot of the game because they like to compete against other players, they're going to stick around for a long time. So if your game or your client's game has the ability to track this, and there's actually a lot of data there to be useful, it would be something really interesting to take a look at and to pay attention to, again, the number of matches or the actual physical rank that some of these players are doing. Because again, the idea then would be that if you can use some of this data to point your campaign in your campaigns towards users more likely to be a lot more active players, that makes tons of sense, right? And I mentioned some social elements, which is why some of the other in-app events examples, as you can see here, for attention also includes adding friends. So if a user has added a lot of friends, that probably means they're either trying to get a lot of their friends to play with them, or they are getting a lot of friends to play with them, meaning that they'll stick around for a lot longer than a few days. And then, of course, actually physically joining a guild or clan, which is basically means a group of players. This means, again, that they have an active group of people they're going to be playing the game longer with, and that is a pretty good signal most of the time that they're going to stick around for a lot longer. So if you have an advanced model game and you want to go after users that are going to be doing a lot more than just playing for a couple of days, these are some really good events to consider focusing on, and then definitely having whatever events that are happening very frequently to have your campaigns be optimized. Now, when it comes to revenue, because as we all know, most game developers want to focus on ROI, ROAS. There's a few more different things that you can consider here, right? So I mentioned in the normal model example that you could start looking at the specific purchases that a user makes, not just the first thing they purchase. Well, that gets into a whole nother level here, because a lot of these games typically have this functionality where you can just collect a lot of things, or if it's one of those games where you get to build a better base, a better team of monsters, or you just get better gear, right? Sometimes you actually want to pay attention to physically what kind of deals in your game store that players are purchasing. Because if you notice that there are specific deals that work better than others, that happen more frequently than others, and you want to maximize users that are more likely to do those things, well, then you're certainly going to want to be able to track not only what those purchases are, but how often they're being purchased. Other thing I would say too is that most games nowadays, especially to help improve their onboarding process, they'll typically release these starter packs, right? So let's say I'm only a couple hours or maybe an hour in the game, but I'm liking it so far. And I noticed that there's a starter pack I can purchase where it gives me a lot of cool things to do in the game, right? Looking at the frequency and the actual percentage of players who actually buy those sorts of deals would be very interesting to use in your campaigns, because again, if you're able to help angle more of your campaigns to go for users doing that, then I would imagine a good percentage of those users who buy this starter pack probably stick around to becoming a lot more profitable in terms of user revenue for most of these game developers. So definitely would say, to summarize the revenue section of it, look at the specific things that users are actually engaging with, whether they're actually paying real money or, again, using these free samples, because those could be much more rich signals sometimes of whether this user is going to be even more profitable, other than the user who just bought the first thing they saw, which might be worth $1, right? So again, it's usually games in these advanced models where there's a lot of flexibility in what you can do here. And it makes it really exciting then to start recording some of these events and passing that back as data for optimization. So to conclude, here are the main action items that you as a developer want to consider if you want to bolster your user acquisition with Google, or if you are a marketing partner working with a game developer. The first thing would be, again, if you haven't already, feel free to actually launch Universal App Campaigns, especially UAC Actions, which is the one that allows you to bid on TCPA, even with the standard in-app events. And that's okay, because you actually want to start getting experience with how some of these campaigns that optimize towards events optimize towards users doing this in-app events, just so you can get your feet wet basically with understanding, hey, do I have the right bids? Do I have the right budgets? Do I have the right creatives, etc. As most of the time to track specific custom events, if you already don't happen to have those, it takes time to be able to track those to determine what events it is. So there's no harm in starting off with the basic events, because that's going to be good practice for later on. And if you happen to actually see a lot of success already with the standard in-app events, then that's great. And then you can continue to grow your strategy with Google and then eventually use other in-app events to go further beyond that, right? The second thing that I would recommend for marketers and partners to do is to, as I mentioned, work with cross-functional teams. And one of the first teams you're going to want to start having a lot more conversations with are going to be your business intelligence, data, BI teams. Because whatever your KPIs happen to be, whether you want to maximize revenue or get users playing the game for a lot longer, you want to understand and figure out that other than these standard events of purchase and maybe tutorial complete, what other events matter? Maybe you have an idea, maybe you have no idea. But you're never going to figure out until you start having those conversations to help push your data teams to start doing some analysis to figure out if there are some events that do make a lot of sense. And just a quick note here, some of the events that you want to focus on in terms of what the data looks like is that you want to focus on events that happen pretty frequently, but that don't happen so frequently where they don't actually mean much, right? So that's where it takes a bit of time to understand that, hey, these events that I'm looking at, they happen pretty frequently and they happen pretty early. But the main way to understand that if they are valuable to you, you have to see if there's some statistically significant data to suggest that, oh, actually, you know what? I take a look at our best users that play the game every single month, and it seems like a lot of them are doing these 5 things within the first couple of days. That's where you want to get to, and that's why talking to your data team, talking to your dev team to figure out what those events are is important, because you're going to be using those events to do the next 2 steps, which is to actually set up tracking and pass these events back into AdWords to then use in Universal App Campaigns to actually find more users that are basically doing those things and look like those players that are valuable to you. So that's why it's going to take a lot of work. It's not always going to be perfect, right? Sometimes you'll be experimenting with events that might seem like they don't mean a whole lot, but that's still okay, because if you actually start passing those events into AdWords, and maybe they don't 100% directly correlate with revenue or directly correlate with retention, you can still use those to make your general ad buying a lot more effective. So definitely make sure to work with your data teams to get those events in AdWords. And then lastly, once you have all those things set up, the last thing you'll be doing is using that data from your campaigns and from your buying to then improve either how the campaigns are doing or even the game itself. So I gave an example earlier of potentially using these new events to feed into your campaigns. And then as you get users, you might start getting some data or start seeing some trends here of, hey, now that we're actually tracking some of these level up, some of these stage complete events, I'm noticing that whenever we get users that actually make in-app purchase, they're going way past chapter 10. But it seems like there's a lot of users that install the game, but maybe they drop off after chapter 5. What's going on there, right? And then now you, as the marketer, because you're not spending time managing a lot of these things in the campaign, you can actually go to your dev team, go to your BI team and say, hey, I'm noticing this kind of drop off. Is there any way we can maybe improve this sort of gap? Or actually, are there other signals we can use that happen between these two events that maybe can help me make my ad buying a lot more effective? That's just one very specific example. But the crazy thing about all this is that now with Universal App Campaigns is that as marketers and as marketing partners, you have the ability to actually advise on this now. And again, as you all know, if you improve the quality of your game and actually improve how your campaigns do from an ad buying perspective, then everything's going to look a lot better, right? You're going to have much more active players, and you're for sure going to make a lot of money. So again, these are the main steps to really take if you've learned anything from this primary episode. But again, this is very new as we've just launched this TCPA event bidding product, I would say about a few weeks or a couple of months ago. And I can tell you just from my experience, it's still very early days. So if you're watching this right now and you have a lot of interesting ideas for in-app events to use, definitely do it. Because I can tell you right now, not a lot of your competitors have figured this out yet. So definitely make use of this to help improve the performance of your campaigns on Google. And with that, that's all I really had. So happy to take any questions at this point. Let's see what's in the Q&A section here. OK, so there's already a couple of questions here just from this talk. So I'm happy to go over some of the initial ones. So the first question could be, how many events should I import into AdWords? Well, the good news is there's no hard limit because in actuality, the more events you pass back into AdWords, the more data you have, not only to feed our machine learning algorithm, but then also to see how your campaigns are doing. Sometimes it could be something as simple as realizing that 20% of your users get farther in the game when it comes from maybe these sorts of ads or these sorts of targeting strategies. But if you never had those events to begin with, as a marketer, you might have no idea what's going on. Right, so my answer to this question would basically be the more in-app events you import, the better, because your marketer is going to appreciate you for it. And again, it's more data to work with to help improve how you buy and how to improve your game. All right, and the second question I could see here is, what if we don't know how to value some of these in-app events that happen before a purchase? That's a great question because some of the developers that have these really complex PLTV or lifetime value models, they could probably tell you, or they could tell us in our campaigns what that actually means. But for most developers, you might not have that on hand, right? So if you don't know how to value some of these in-app events that might happen before a purchase or a really, really valuable event that is directly correlated with your KPI, that's okay. Is because what I would recommend is actually you start passing them back into AdWords. And before you even start bidding on those events, just see what the distribution looks like from your standard app install campaigns or your universal app campaigns optimized towards purchases, right? Just pass those events in to see what it looks like. Because when you start getting actual physical data from your ad buying of what the distribution is, you can then start forming some ideas of, okay, well, maybe it's worth this much to us. And if it's worth this much to us, then if we start bidding or getting users doing this event at this specific cost, do we improve ROAS? Do we improve retention, right? So no worries if you don't have the values on hand. It's a lot more important actually to start passing it back in so you get the data and then start experimenting with it. Otherwise, if you wait for whoever it is in your team or your client's team to figure out a fully robust PLTV model, you don't necessarily want to use all that time to give your other competitors that are experimenting with a few things. So summary is, don't worry, just experiment, but then start using the data to help you form some opinions. All right, another question here would be, what are some resources I can check if my game is doing well compared to other similar games? That's a really great question. So there is actually a lot of different databases out there that give you some ideas of how other games are doing when compared to an install perspective, but also a revenue perspective. So a few of the other ones I've used before are databases such as App Annie, such as Apptopia, and of course, even just looking at other things online to help give you some idea of competitive benchmarking. So you can use those primarily to understand that, hey, if I want to understand how to improve retention, are my retention rates good? Are my pair rates good? Those are some sorts of resources you could basically use to help get a sense of that as well. All right, and then seems like one of the last questions on here is, how do I test which in-app event is the best for UAC to optimize for? So the best way to understand if this is a really good event for you is that you want this event to happen pretty frequently, basically. And the more frequent and the earlier you have this event happen, the quicker it's going to be for our UAC Universal App Campaigns to respond to. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend, for example, an event that happens, say, once, maybe every month, right? Because then that basically means, okay, well, first of all, that means that I'm not going to get any feedback on this until a month. And especially if I want to have the machine learning behind the Universal App Campaigns learn quick, that might not make a lot of sense. So I would say that when you're testing in-app events, if you feel like the in-app event is going to happen pretty frequently within the first 1 to 3 days, and then also be indicative too. So it's not just a very shallow event that it seems like 99% of people who even just open the app seem to do. That might not be that valuable. But let's say it's an in-app event that happens pretty close. Maybe it happens after the first couple hours or first couple of days, but maybe only 50% of users do that event, or maybe only 30% of users do that event. So if you know what that is, and then you're able to optimize your campaigns towards that event, it's going to make a lot of sense, because then you've effectively pointed the campaign towards the 30% or 50% of users that matter to you. And as a marketer, if you're able to do that with a really cost-effective way, in other words, let's just say, for example, you're used to paying $5 per install, and only 30% of those folks actually get to this in-app event you're talking about, and then eventually become a valuable user. Well, imagine if you instead only would have to pay just a few percentage points more because you're able to bid the right way and structure the campaign the right way to get those users that actually matter to you. It's really good, right? So one of the best ways to test, is this in-app event working well, is to look at the frequency to make sure it's happening within the first couple of days or so, and then whether it's happening pretty frequently. Because for our campaigns, especially once you have a lot of in-app events firing from these campaigns every day, anywhere north of, let's say, 20, 30, 40 of these in-app events, that's when it's really good. So look for those metrics when you want to understand, hey, is this in-app event working well for my Universal App Campaign? And with that, that looks like that's all of the questions. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Again, my name is Bao, and this has been another great episode of Google Partners Academy on Air.